If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Victor Blackburn, and I've seen things in Blackwood Ridge that no one should ever have to see. At 54, I thought my days of being scared ended after Vietnam, where I worked as a tracker in the dense jungles. But what I encountered in these Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia made those war memories feel like a walk in the park. I came to Blackwood Ridge 15 years ago, taking the job as senior ranger after my wife Sarah died. The quiet of the forest seemed like the perfect escape from my grief. The locals welcomed me, though they always got quiet whenever anyone mentioned the old stories about the ridge. At first, I didn't pay much attention to their whispered warnings about those who steal faces, or the tales of people going missing every few years. The ranger station became my new home, a simple two-story wooden building surrounded by towering oak and pine trees. My office wall held yellowed newspaper clippings about 3 hikers who vanished in 1947, and another 7 who disappeared without a trace in 1957. I used to think they just got lost in the caves or fell down old mining shafts. How wrong I was. I remember the day everything changed. It was just after the biggest thunderstorm I'd seen in years. The rain had finally stopped, and the morning air felt heavy and wrong, like the moment before lightning strikes. The radio on my belt kept crackling with static, which was unusual because we just installed a new system last month. That morning, I found the first signs. Footprints in the mud, 17 inches long, deeper than any human or animal print I'd ever seen. Next to them lay a dead deer, but something was terribly wrong with it. Its face, it wasn't torn off like an animal attack. It was removed, clean and precise, like someone had used a surgeon's knife. But what really made my blood run cold were the trees. Some of the oldest oaks, trees that had stood for hundreds of years, had strange symbols carved into their bark. These weren't the usual marks left by teenagers or hikers. These cuts were fresh, deep, and they seemed to pulse with a faint glow in the early morning mist. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the fog rolled in thick and fast. That's when I saw it, a figure standing between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet. But its face, there was no face, just a smooth, blank surface where features should have been. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew, deep in my gut, that something horrible had awakened in Blackwood Ridge. Something that had been here long before me. Something that the local Native Americans had tried to warn us about. And now, after years of silence, it was hungry again. This is the story of what happened next. 7 days of terror that changed everything I thought I knew about reality. A week that cost me my left eye, left permanent scars on my face, and gave me abilities I never wanted. But most importantly, it's a warning about what still lurks in the shadows of Blackwood Ridge, waiting for the next time the moon is right and the fog rolls in. That first day started normally enough. I called in my junior ranger, Mike Peters, a good kid, just 23, who loved these woods almost as much as I did. We needed to check for any storm damage along the main hiking trails. "Hey, Victor," Mike said, his usual cheerful smile on his face as he walked into my office. "Some storm last night, huh?" My dog wouldn't stop barking at the windows. I showed him the strange footprints I'd found, and the deer with its missing face. His smile disappeared quickly. Something about those prints made both of us uneasy. They were too perfect, too clean, like someone had pressed a giant mold into the mud. We split up to cover more ground. Mike took the eastern trails while I headed west. The forest felt different that morning. Usually you'd hear birds singing, squirrels rushing through the trees, and all the normal sounds of wildlife. But everything was quiet, too quiet. Around noon, my radio crackled to life. It was Mike, but his voice sounded strange, shaky. "Victor, I think someone's watching me. There's this weird taste in my ear, like metal. And the fog, it shouldn't be this foggy at noon, should it?" "Mike, where are you exactly?" I asked, already starting to jog in his direction. Near Copper Creek Bridge. But Victor, something's not right. The fog is moving, like it has a mind of its own. Wait. Oh God. Victor, there's someone. The radio went dead. I ran as fast as I could toward Copper Creek, my heart pounding. The fog was getting thicker by the second, and that metallic taste Mike mentioned, I could sense it too, like putting a battery on your tongue. When I reached the bridge, all I found was Mike's radio, his water bottle, and a single boot. The mud around the area was smooth, no footprints, no signs of struggle. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. That afternoon, 2 hikers were found near the old mining entrance. Their faces were gone, removed with the same surgical precision as the deer. But there was something worse. Their eyes were still wide open, and their expressions, it looked like they died screaming. I called in every ranger from neighboring stations and contacted the local police. As we set up a search party, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Through the trees, I kept seeing glimpses of tall, thin figures standing perfectly still. But every time I turned to look directly at them, they were gone. That night, as I sat in my office looking at maps and making calls, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was Mike's voice, coming from the darkness outside my window, calling my name. But it wasn't quite right, like someone was trying to copy his voice but couldn't get it exactly right. I knew then that whatever had taken Mike wasn't human, and this was just the beginning of our nightmare. The next morning, 4 of us went out searching for Mike, me, 2 local police officers named Jim and Steve, and Sarah from the rescue team. The fog was so thick you could barely see 20 feet ahead. Our flashlight beams looked weird in it, like they were being swallowed up. "Look at this," Sarah called out, pointing her light at a tree. More of those strange symbols had appeared overnight, but these were different. They seemed to be dripping some kind of dark liquid. When I touched it, my fingers went numb. That's when we heard Mike's voice again. "Help! I'm over here!" It came from somewhere in the fog. But then we heard it again, from a completely different direction. And again, and again. Soon Mike's voice was coming from everywhere around us. Jim, the younger officer, started walking toward one of the voices. "Wait," I grabbed his arm. "Something's not right." But he pulled away and disappeared into the fog. We heard his scream about 10 seconds later. When we found Jim, he was standing perfectly still, facing away from us. "Jim?" Steve called out to his partner. Slowly, Jim turned around. I'll never forget what I saw. His face was gone, just smooth skin where his features should have been. But somehow, he was still standing. "Run!" I yelled. As we turned to escape, I saw them, tall figures moving through the fog. They didn't walk like normal people. It was more like they were gliding, and they were getting closer. We ran as fast as we could. I could hear Steve panting behind me, and Sarah's quick footsteps. Then Steve's breathing stopped. When I looked back, he was gone. Sarah screamed. I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the ranger station. We were almost there when she stopped suddenly. Her hand felt cold in mine. When I turned to look at her, she was staring at something behind me, her eyes wide with terror. "Victor," she whispered. "It's wearing Jim's face." I spun around and saw it, one of the tall creatures, but now it had Jim's face stretched across its featureless head like a mask. It tilted its head at an impossible angle, and when it spoke, it used Jim's voice perfectly. "Why are you running, Victor?" I yanked Sarah toward the station, but she wouldn't move. Another figure had appeared in front of us, this one wearing Steve's face. We were surrounded. Sarah's hand slipped from mine. By the time I turned back, they had her. I ran for the station, her screams echoing behind me. I made it inside and locked every door and window. That night, I sat in my office with my old service revolver, listening to the voices of my friends calling out to me from the darkness. But I knew they weren't really my friends anymore. The worst part? Every few minutes I'd hear Sarah's voice too, begging me to let her in. It sounded exactly like her, not Sarah from the rescue team, but my dead wife, Sarah. Whatever these things were, they were getting into my head, using my memories against me. By morning, I knew I had to do something. 7 people were now missing or dead, and those things were still out there. I called the state police, but when they finally arrived, things only got worse. The helicopter showed up around noon. The fog had cleared a bit, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd get some help. I watched from the fire tower as it circled overhead. That's when I heard the pilot's voice on my radio. "What the? That's impossible," he said, his voice shaking. I can see my own face down there in the trees." The helicopter started spinning wildly. I watched helplessly as it crashed into the forest. The explosion lit up the trees, and in that flash of light, I saw dozens of those tall figures standing around the crash site, completely still, like trees themselves. That's when I remembered something from the old Native American stories. These creatures, they were afraid of their own reflection. It made sense now. They never appeared near the lake or any shiny surfaces. I spent that afternoon gathering every mirror and reflective surface I could find. Old CDs, signal mirrors from survival kits, even the side mirror from my truck. I had a plan, but I needed to understand more about these things first. I went to the station's basement where we kept the old records. In a dusty box, I found reports from 1947 and 1957. The same pattern, people vanishing, strange fog, and those symbols on the trees. But there was something else, a map showing old mine tunnels under the forest. The sun was setting when I heard something scratching at the basement door. Through the crack underneath, this thick, white fog started seeping in. My flashlight began flickering, and that metallic taste filled my mouth again. "Victor," my wife Sarah's voice called softly. "Please, let me in. I've missed you so much." My hands were shaking as I set up the mirrors around me in a circle. The door slowly creaked open. What stepped in wasn't my Sarah. It was tall, impossibly tall, wearing her face like a mask. Behind it, more figures crowded the doorway, each wearing the faces of people they'd taken: Mike, Jim, Steve, Sarah from the rescue team, and others I didn't recognize. But I was ready for them. I clicked on my emergency flares, and the light bounced off the mirrors, filling the room with bright reflections. The creatures screamed, not with human voices anymore, but with a sound like metal scraping on metal. They could see themselves now, their true forms reflected in every mirror. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. In their panic, they started tearing at their stolen faces, revealing what was underneath. Under those faces was nothing. Just a swirling darkness, like looking into a deep well at midnight. But somehow, in that darkness, I could see memories, not just mine, but memories from everyone whose face they'd stolen. They were feeding on these memories, living through them over and over. I had to move fast. While they were confused by their reflections, I ran past them up the basement stairs, but they recovered quickly. I could hear them gliding after me, their movements making that awful whisper-quiet sound. I ran to the fire tower, the highest point in Blackwood Ridge. In my backpack, I had my last hope, white phosphorus flares from my Vietnam days. I'd kept them all these years, never thinking I'd need them again. The fog was so thick now I could barely see the tower steps. As I climbed, I heard them below me. They weren't even pretending to be human anymore. The faces they wore were melting off, dripping into the fog. At the top of the tower, I set my trap. Mirrors on all sides, flares ready to light. Then, I waited. They came up slowly, surrounding the tower. The one wearing Sarah's face spoke first, but now its voice was different, like many voices talking at once. "Victor," it said, "we've lived in these woods for thousands of years. We remember when the first people came. We remember their faces too. Won't you join us? We can give Sarah back to you. We can give you back everything you've lost." For a moment, just a moment, I wanted to say yes. The thing wearing Sarah's face reached out to me, and I could smell her perfume, just like I remembered. But then I saw its reflection in one of the mirrors, that swirling darkness where a face should be, and I knew what I had to do. I lit the flares, all of them at once. The white phosphorus light was like a miniature sun, bouncing off every mirror. The creatures screamed, their stolen faces burning away in the light. They tried to retreat, but the mirrors had them trapped in a cage of reflections. That's when I saw it, a dark hole opening in the tower floor. They were trying to escape through the roots of the trees, just like the old stories said they could. But I wasn't going to let them get away. Not this time. I threw my last flare into the hole. The light chased them down, through their underground tunnels. Their screams echoed up from deep below the earth, getting fainter and fainter until everything went quiet. But the victory came with a price. The bright light had burned my left eye completely. Half my face was scarred from the heat. And something else had changed too. I could still sense them, somewhere deep underground, waiting. Just waiting. The government showed up the next day, men in dark suits, who said they were from a department I'd never heard of. They closed off the entire forest and told everyone it was because of a chemical spill. But I knew better, and so did they. They took my statement, but I could tell they'd seen this before. One of them, an older man named Thompson, stayed behind to talk to me privately. "You're not crazy, Blackburn," he said, showing me a thick file. "These things, we've been tracking them for decades. They show up every 11 years, always during the full moon." He paused, looking at my scarred face. "But nobody's ever survived a direct encounter like you did." The changes in me started slowly. First, I couldn't recognize faces anymore, a condition the doctors called prosopagnosia. But it was more than that. I could sense things others couldn't. Sometimes, when I walk in the woods, I know exactly where the hollow spaces are underground. And the worst part? I can feel when they're awake down there. The forest is different now. The trees where it all happened grow without bark, their wood smooth and pale like skin. Animals avoid that area completely. Sometimes, hikers report seeing strange shadows moving through the fog, but we keep them away from the dangerous parts. I still work as a ranger, but mostly behind a desk now. My left eye is gone, replaced with a glass one that sometimes fogs up for no reason. The right side of my face looks normal, but the left side, well, let's just say I understand why children sometimes get scared when they see me. The strangest thing? Every full moon, I find new symbols carved into the trees near my cabin. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I hear whispers coming from the ground, whispers in voices I used to know. Thompson visits every few months to check on me. He says, I'm valuable now, someone who knows what's really out there. But he also warned me that these things, these hollow men, they hold grudges. And 11 years isn't that long to wait, not for creatures that have lived for thousands of years. So I keep my mirrors ready. I've installed bright lights all around my cabin. And every night, before I go to sleep, I check to make sure my face is still my own in the mirror. Because deep down, I know they're not gone. They're just waiting. And the worst part? We're getting closer to the 11-year mark. The fog has been thicker lately. The radios are starting to crackle with static again. And last week, I found a fresh footprint, 17 inches long, in the mud behind my cabin. They're coming back, and this time, they remember me. I've been getting ready for their return. Every day, I check my special alarm system, mirrors connected to motion sensors all around my property. I've installed the brightest lights I could find, powered by 3 backup generators. No chances this time. Last month, I found something interesting in the old mining records. There's a huge cave system right under Blackwood Ridge that nobody's mapped completely. That's got to be where they hide. Thompson thinks they might have been there even before the first people came to these mountains. Strange things have started happening again. Last week, my dog Rex wouldn't stop barking at the trees. When I went to check, I found one of those symbols carved fresh into my front porch, still dripping that weird liquid that makes your fingers go numb. Then yesterday, I got a call from the new junior ranger, Amy. She said she saw a tall figure standing in the fog near Copper Creek Bridge, the same place where Mike disappeared. I told her to stay away from that area, but I'm worried. These things, they know how to make people curious. They know how to draw you in. The worst part is the dreams. Every night now I see them wearing the faces they stole. They talk to me, telling me they can fix my scars, give me back my eye, make everything like it was before. Sometimes I wake up and find myself walking toward the woods, like they're calling me in my sleep. But I'm not the same man they faced 11 years ago. I understand them better now. They don't just steal faces. They steal memories, experiences, everything that makes a person who they are. And they keep it all, down there in the dark, like some twisted collection. Thompson brought me some new equipment last week. Special cameras that can see through fog, and lights that burn brighter than phosphorus flares. He says other rangers across the country have reported similar things in their forests. Makes me wonder just how many of these creatures are out there. This morning, I found something that chilled me to the bone. A photograph slipped under my door. It's old, from 1947, showing a ranger standing in front of the station. He looks exactly like me, same build, same stance. But his face, it's completely smooth, like it was erased. The full moon is coming in 3 days. The fog is getting thicker every morning, and last night I heard Sarah's voice again calling from the woods. But this time, I'm ready for them. Tonight's the night. The full moon is rising, and the fog is rolling in thicker than I've ever seen it. I'm in the fire tower now, writing this down while I still can. My hands are shaking, but not from fear. This time, I'm ready. I've turned the tower into a trap. Mirrors cover every wall, and UV lights are mounted at every angle. Thompson's team helped me install special sensors that can detect their presence. Right now, all the sensors are flashing red. They're coming. The first sign is always the radio. It's crackling with that familiar static, but now I can almost make out words in the noise. They're speaking in voices I haven't heard in years, my old friends, my family, Sarah. I can see them now, gliding through the fog below. There are more of them than last time. Some are wearing faces I recognize from missing person reports across the country. But their movements are different, more careful, like they remember what happened last time. Wait. Something's wrong. The backup generator just failed. Half my lights are out. I can hear them whispering from all directions now. "Victor, we brought someone to see you." Through my remaining lights, I can see a figure climbing the tower steps. It's moving like a person, not like them. As it gets closer, I recognize the walk, the shape. It's me. They've made a perfect copy of me, but its face is blank, waiting to take mine. The fog is seeping through the floorboards now. My last lights are flickering. I can hear them sliding against the walls of the tower, surrounding me. The mirrors are starting to crack by themselves. But I've got one last trick, something they don't know about. Thompson's team found out their true weakness. It's not just light or reflections. It's... The writing stops here, the pen leaving a long scratch across the page. The rest of the journal is empty, except for a single line written in different handwriting. "Thank you for your face, Victor. It fits perfectly." Below this, there's one final note, written in what appears to be Victor's shaking hand. "If you're reading this, stay away from Blackwood Ridge. And if you ever hear a familiar voice calling from the fog, run. Because it's not really them calling. It's us." When Thompson's team reached the fire tower the next morning, they found a scene that made no sense. All the mirrors were shattered, but the pieces were arranged in perfect circles on the floor. The UV lights had melted, dripping down the walls like wax. And there, in the center of it all, was my ranger's badge, twisted into an impossible shape. But I wasn't gone. Not completely. They found me 3 days later, walking along Copper Creek Bridge. At least it looked like me. I had all my memories, could answer all their questions about my past. I even had my scars and my glass eye. Everything seemed normal. Except for one thing, I couldn't cast a reflection anymore. Not in mirrors, not in water, not anywhere. The doctors can't explain it. Thompson's team keeps running tests, but they don't understand what happened in that tower. How could they? They weren't there when the Hollow Men showed me their true power, the ability to make you one of them while letting you keep just enough of yourself to remember who you used to be. I still work as a ranger at Blackwood Ridge. Tourists and hikers see me every day, and to them, I look completely normal. But the animals know. They run when I get close. Birds stop singing when I walk under their trees. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the others, my new family, moving through the fog. We protect our territory now, keeping our forest safe from those who would disturb our sleep. And yes, every 11 years, we need new faces. The old ones wear out, you see. They dry up, like leaves in autumn. The strangest part? I'm not scared anymore. The darkness beneath my borrowed face feels right, natural, like I was always meant to be this way. So if you're ever hiking in Blackwood Ridge and you see a ranger with a glass eye and scars on the left side of his face, just remember, I'm still Victor Blackburn. I still protect these woods. I just do it differently now. And if you hear someone calling your name from the fog, well, maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe it's me inviting you to join our family. After all, we're always looking for new faces to wear. The fog is rolling in again. I have to go now. My family is calling. Remember, every face tells a story. And in Blackwood Ridge, we collect stories that last forever. My name is Dr. James Winters, and I never thought I'd have to tell this story. But people need to know what happened at Research Station Alpha last winter. What I saw there, what I became. It changed everything I thought I knew about our world. I used to be a normal scientist, studying weather patterns in the northern wilderness. Tall, dark-haired, and probably too serious for my own good. That's what my colleagues used to say. Now when I look in the mirror, I barely recognize the white-haired man staring back at me. It all started 3 months ago when I arrived at Research Station Alpha. The station wasn't much to look at, just a bunch of gray buildings surrounded by endless snow and pine trees. We were so far north that during winter, we'd only get a few hours of daylight. The nearest town was 4 hours away by car, when the roads weren't buried in snow. My job was simple. Study the unusual weather patterns that had been happening in the area. Local weather stations had been picking up weird temperature drops that didn't make any sense. We're talking about places suddenly freezing over in minutes, even when it wasn't that cold around them. The station had everything we needed: weather monitoring equipment, a small lab, sleeping quarters, and enough food to last 6 months. There were 5 of us at first: me, 2 research assistants named Sarah and Mike, and 2 station maintenance workers, Tom and Bill. The first week was normal, boring even. We set up our equipment, took readings, and I spent most of my time staring at computer screens. But then the strange things started happening. Our equipment began showing temperature readings that were impossible. Spots of minus 150 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle of nowhere. The local wildlife started acting weird too. We'd see entire herds of deer running past the station, even though they should have been miles away in their winter grounds. But what really got my attention was the ranger's report. Jack, he was the local park ranger, called in one morning about strange frost patterns he'd found. He said they looked like massive footprints, each one surrounded by a perfect circle of ice, even on bare rock. I remember telling him to take photos and bring them to the station. That was the last time anyone heard from Jack, and that's when our nightmare really began. Looking back now, I should have seen the signs. The way the wind would sometimes carry sounds that seemed almost like words. The strange shapes we'd catch moving in the blizzards. The growing feeling of hunger that no amount of food could satisfy. But I was a scientist. I believed in facts, in things I could measure and explain. I didn't believe in monsters. I should have. The morning after Jack's last call, I woke up to Sarah banging on my door. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking as she told me we needed to check the security cameras right away. On the grainy footage from the previous night, we saw something that made my blood run cold. Jack's truck was there, parked just at the edge of our camera's view, but Jack wasn't in it. Instead, we could see his flashlight beam dancing wildly in the darkness, and then it just stopped. The snow was falling so heavily that we couldn't see much else, but something seemed to move in the blizzard, something tall and thin that shouldn't have been there. "We need to find him," Mike said, and I agreed. We put together a search team, me, Mike, and Tom, while Sarah and Bill stayed at the station to monitor the radios. The temperature outside was dropping fast, much faster than it should have. We found Jack's truck first. The engine was still warm, but the driver's door was wide open, and Jack's footprints led away from it. But these weren't normal footprints. They were deep, like he'd been running. Running from something. We followed the tracks, and that's when I noticed something odd. Every few feet, there was another set of prints. Huge prints, bigger than any human should be. And around each one, the snow had turned to solid ice. "Dr. Winters," Tom whispered, pointing at something ahead. "Look, there, standing perfectly straight against a tree, was Jack. But something was terribly wrong. His whole body was covered in a layer of ice so thick it looked like glass. His face was frozen in an expression of pure fear, and his hand was still raised, pointing at something in the forest. The worst part? The ice around him was in a perfect circle, like something had frozen him in place with a single touch. We tried to radio back to the station, but all we got was static and a sound that made my skin crawl, like someone whispering, but not in any language I'd ever heard. Then we heard it, a sound like cracking ice, coming from all around us. The temperature dropped so fast, our breath turned to ice crystals in the air. Through the swirling snow, I saw something move. Something impossibly tall and thin, leaving trails of frost wherever it went. "Run," I whispered. "Run!" We ran back toward the station as fast as we could. Behind us, I heard Tom scream, but when I turned to look, he was gone. Just gone. Only his footprints remained, ending in a circle of ice. Mike and I made it back to the station, slamming the doors behind us. But as we caught our breath, I realized something terrible. We could hear voices outside. Voices that sounded exactly like Tom and Jack, calling for help. And that was just the beginning of our nightmare. We spent that night huddled in the station's main room, listening to those voices outside. They kept calling us, using Tom's voice, then Jack's, begging us to let them in. Sarah was crying quietly in the corner, while Bill tried to get any kind of radio signal. Mike just sat there, staring at the frost, slowly creeping up our windows. I tried to think like a scientist. In my shaking hands, I held the temperature readings from that day. They showed something impossible, a moving cold spot, colder than anything naturally possible on Earth, circling our station like a shark. The next morning, when the sun finally came up, we found massive handprints of ice on all our windows. Each one was twice the size of a normal human hand. But that wasn't the worst part. Our food storage room had somehow frozen solid, even though it was inside the heated building. "We need help," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to call for evacuation." Bill managed to get through to the ranger station on our emergency radio. They said they'd send a search party, 5 experienced rangers with cold weather gear. I wanted to tell them not to come, that they'd only be putting more people in danger, but I was too scared of staying here alone. The search party arrived that afternoon. I'll never forget the look on their faces when we told them what happened. They didn't believe us, of course. Why would they? It all sounded crazy. "Look," their leader, Rogers, said, "we'll split up and search the area. Whatever's going on, we'll find it." I begged them to stay together, to wait until morning, but they wouldn't listen. They headed out in different directions, their flashlights cutting through the early winter darkness. An hour later, the screaming started. One by one, their radios went dead. We heard horrible sounds, cracking ice, muffled screams, and that awful whispering. Through our cameras, We caught glimpses of something moving in the snow, something that looked like a skeleton made of ice, impossibly tall, with long fingers that left trails of frost in the air. The blizzard came out of nowhere, the worst I'd ever seen. The temperature dropped so fast our thermometers couldn't keep up. And in the howling wind, we could hear it, the sound of the search party's voices, all of them now, calling out to us. But their voices were wrong, somehow. Like something else was trying to speak using their mouths. That night, we discovered something else. We were all hungry. Not normal hungry, but a deep, gnawing hunger that made our stomachs hurt. No matter how much we ate, it wouldn't go away. And when I caught Mike staring at Sarah's arm like it was a piece of meat, I knew we were in even more trouble than I thought. The thing outside wasn't just trying to freeze us, it was trying to make us like it. The next few days were a blur of fear and hunger. We took turns watching each other, making sure no one was alone. The hunger was getting worse. I caught myself thinking thoughts that scared me. Every time I looked at the others, I could feel my mouth watering. I knew they were feeling it too. Bill was the first to break. We found him in the kitchen at 3 a.m., eating raw frozen meat with his bare hands. His eyes looked wild, not human anymore. When we tried to stop him, he attacked Sarah, trying to. I can't even say it. Mike and I had to lock him in the storage room. We could hear him in there, scratching at the door, making sounds that weren't words anymore. The thing outside seemed to know we were breaking. The voices changed. Now they sounded like children crying, like people we loved begging for help. The ice on our windows grew thicker, forming strange patterns that looked like faces screaming. Sarah found some old books in the station's library about local legends. She showed me stories about something called a wendigo, a spirit that brought winter and made people hungry for human flesh. The more I read, the more I felt sick. Everything matched: the ice, the voices, the hunger. Then the helicopter came. We hadn't called for one. Our radio was dead by then. But we heard it circling overhead, and for a moment, we felt hope. That's when the impossible storm hit. The sky turned black in seconds. We watched in horror as ice formed on the helicopter's blades. It spun out of control, disappearing into the whiteness. The crash shook the whole station. We wanted to help, but we couldn't go out there. Not with that thing waiting. Through our cameras, we saw 4 people climb out of the wreck. They tried to run toward our station. They never made it. It was like watching a nightmare in slow motion. One by one, they froze in place. The thing moved so fast, 1 second it was a shadow in the snow. The next it was right there, touching them with those long, icy fingers. Each time it touched someone, they turned to ice instantly, like statues. That night, the hunger got so bad that Sarah started crying blood. Mike couldn't stop shaking. And me? I could feel something changing inside me. Every time I breathed, I could see my breath turning to ice, even inside the heated station. We knew we had to do something. We couldn't just wait to either freeze or become something worse. That's when I remembered something from Sarah's research, something about fire and ancient rituals, and the power of the northern lights. We had one chance, just one. But first, we had to survive until the aurora borealis came. Sarah's research said the wendigo was weakest during the aurora borealis, the northern lights. We had a weather forecast showing they would appear in 3 days, but those 3 days felt like 3 years. Mike lost it on the second day. I found him in the lab, chewing on his own fingers. His eyes were white, like they were frozen from the inside. We had to lock him up with Bill. Now it was just me and Sarah, and I could see she was barely holding on. The station got colder every hour. Our heaters were running full blast, but ice kept creeping in. It formed weird shapes on the walls like long, skinny people reaching out to grab us. The voices outside got louder. Now they sounded like Mike and Bill too, begging us to let them out. I worked on our only chance, a makeshift flamethrower using the station's fuel supply. Sarah found an old Native American ritual in her books. We needed both fire and ancient words. When the northern lights came, The night before the aurora, Sarah grabbed my arm. "James," she whispered, if I start to, you know what to do." I nodded, but my heart felt like ice. Then it happened. Sarah's eyes turned white, just like Mike's had. She lunged at me, teeth bared, but I was ready. I locked her in my room, trying to ignore her screams as they turned into something inhuman. I was alone now. The wendigo knew it too. The voices changed again. Now they sounded like my family, my friends, even my dog from when I was a kid. The hunger was so bad, I started hitting my head against the wall, just to think about something else. When the aurora finally started, painting the sky in green and purple, I knew it was time. I could see the wendigo clearly now through the windows, a massive thing made of ice and darkness, with arms too long and a face that looked like a frozen skull. It saw me too. For the first time, it spoke directly to me, using all the voices it had collected. "Join us." I grabbed my flamethrower, the ancient words written on my arm in marker. It was time to end this, one way or another. What happened next still gives me nightmares. I stepped outside into the freezing night. The northern lights danced above me like green and purple fire in the sky. The wendigo stood there, 15 feet tall, its body looking like a skeleton made of ice. Every step it took left frozen footprints that spread like spiderwebs across the snow. My hands shook as I held the flamethrower. The cold was so bad it felt like my blood was turning to ice. But I had to focus. I started reading the ancient words Sarah had found, my voice barely a whisper at first. The wendigo screamed, a sound like breaking ice and dying wolves all mixed together. It moved so fast, like a blur in the snow. One second it was far away, the next it was right in front of me. Its hand reached for my face, long icy fingers just inches away. I pulled the trigger on the flamethrower. Fire shot out, bright orange against the darkness. Where it hit the wendigo, steam hissed and ice cracked. The creature jumped back, making sounds no human throat could make. But it wasn't enough. The wendigo started circling me, moving faster and faster until I was in the middle of a blizzard. I kept spraying fire, kept saying the ancient words, but I was getting tired. The hunger inside me was screaming to give up, to join it. Then I saw them, all its victims, frozen in the ice around me. Jack, Tom, the search party, the helicopter crew. Even Sarah, Mike, and Bill were there now, trapped in clear ice like bugs in amber. Their faces were frozen in screams. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. I held up the flamethrower and shouted the last words of the ritual as loud as I could. The northern lights seemed to pulse brighter, like they were listening. The wendigo rushed at me one last time. I pulled the trigger, putting everything I had left into one final blast. Fire met ice in an explosion of steam and light. I felt its cold fingers touch my face for just a second, before everything went white. When I woke up, the sun was rising. The wendigo was gone, but it had left its mark on me. My dark hair had turned completely white. I couldn't feel hot or cold anymore. And sometimes, when winter comes, I get so hungry. They found me walking through the snow 2 days later. The rescue team said it was a miracle I survived. They never found the others' bodies, just circles of ice where they had been. I quit my job after that. Moved somewhere warm, far from any snow. But every winter, I check the weather reports up north. And when I hear about strange ice storms or missing people, I remember what the wendigo whispered to me at the end. Winter always returns. I know it's still out there, waiting in the endless snow. And sometimes, in my dreams, I can still hear it calling. It's been 5 years since that night at Research Station Alpha. I live in Arizona now, where it never snows. But the wendigo left parts of itself in me that I can't escape. My hair isn't the only thing that changed. Every time a cold front comes, I feel it hours before the weather report knows. My body temperature runs so low now that regular thermometers can't read it. Doctors can't explain it. They just call it a medical mystery. The hunger never completely went away. It gets worse in winter. I have to lock myself in my house during those times, fill my freezer with meat, and try to keep my mind busy. Sometimes I catch myself staring at people on the street, and I have to look away quickly. Last month, I got a letter from a research team planning to reopen Station Alpha. They wanted me to come back as a consultant. They said they'd found something strange in the ice, perfectly preserved bodies, frozen in circles. They're calling it a natural phenomenon. I burned the letter. But that night, I dreamed about the station again. In my dream, I saw the new research team there. Behind them, in the swirling snow, I saw something tall and thin watching them through the windows. It turned its frozen face toward me, like it knew I was watching, and smiled. I woke up to find frost on my bedroom windows, in Arizona, in the middle of summer. Sometimes I think about going back, about warning them, but I know they wouldn't believe me. Scientists never do, until it's too late. So I write this story instead, hoping someone will read it and understand. If you're ever up north and see strange frost patterns, or hear voices in a blizzard calling your name, or feel a hunger that food can't satisfy, run. Run as fast as you can toward warmth and sunlight. Because winter is the wendigo's time, and it never forgets those it has touched. Even now, as I finish writing this, I can feel the temperature dropping. Outside my window, a cold wind is blowing in from the north. And somewhere in that wind, I swear I can hear voices calling. My name is John Running Wolf. At 51 years old, I've spent most of my life protecting these sacred canyons as a Navajo Ranger. The locals know me as the quiet man who walks the trails of Canyon de Chelly every morning, my weathered ranger hat pulled low over my eyes. Before this, I tracked enemies in far-off lands for the Army, but nothing in my military years could have prepared me for what I'm about to tell you. It all started 3 months ago, on a morning that seemed just like any other. The sun was barely peeking over the red canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I was doing my usual dawn patrol, checking the hiking trails and making sure no tourists had wandered where they shouldn't. The air felt different that morning, heavy, like the moment before a storm, except there wasn't a cloud in sight. My skin tingled with that same feeling I used to get in the Army when something bad was about to happen. The canyon was too quiet, no bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the brush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That's when I saw it, fresh markings on the canyon wall that hadn't been there the day before. Now, I know every inch of these walls like the lines on my palm. These weren't your usual tourist graffiti or even ancient petroglyphs. These were different. The symbols looked like they'd been carved into the rock with claws, still dusty fresh. They showed figures that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them too long, human shapes twisting into animal forms. I reached out to touch one of the markings, and the moment my fingers brushed the rock, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The morning sun disappeared behind a sudden dust cloud, even though there wasn't a breeze to stir up the sand. In my 30 years as a ranger, I'd never felt anything like this. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. Those strange markings were the first warning of something ancient and evil awakening in Canyon de Chelly. Something that had been sleeping in these rocks since before my grandfather's grandfather was born. Something that the old stories warned us about, the ones that the elders only whispered around the fire on the darkest nights. I should have known better. The signs were all there. The missing livestock, the strange tracks that seemed to change shape halfway across the sand, the tourists reporting seeing people who looked exactly like their friends standing in two places at once. But sometimes, even when the truth is right in front of you, your mind refuses to believe what your eyes are seeing. This is the story of how I faced the skinwalkers of Shadow Canyon, and how our peaceful corner of Arizona became a battleground between the world of the living and something much, much darker. What I'm about to tell you might sound impossible, but I swear on my ancestors that every word is true. That first week, things started getting stranger by the day. I remember walking down to old Joe's farm after he called about some trouble with his cattle. Old Joe had been raising livestock in the canyon for 40 years, and I'd never heard his voice shake like it did on the phone that morning. When I got there, I found Joe standing by his fence, his hands trembling as he held his coffee mug. In the field behind him lay one of his cows, cut open as clean as if someone had used a surgeon's knife. But there was something wrong about it. No blood anywhere, and no signs of any animals dragging the body. "Never seen anything like it, John," Joe whispered, his eyes fixed on the dead cow. "Found 3 more just like it this week. No tracks around them. Nothing." I knelt down to examine the ground around the cow. The dirt was soft from the morning dew, perfect for leaving footprints. But there weren't any. Not from coyotes, not from mountain lions, not even from the cow itself. It was as if the animal had been dropped from the sky. That evening, I called my old friend Thomas Begay, one of our tribal elders. As I described what I'd found, the silence on his end of the line grew longer and longer. "John," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "come to my house tonight. There are things you need to know." Thomas lived in a small house at the edge of the canyon. When I arrived, he was sitting on his porch, burning sage in an old clay bowl. The sweet smoke drifted around us as he told me stories, ancient stories about shapeshifters that our grandparents had warned about medicine men who turned to dark magic and lost their humanity, about creatures that could wear your face and steal your memories. "The signs are all here," Thomas said, pointing toward the canyon. "The drought has exposed old caves that should have stayed buried. The animals are acting strange. And now, these deaths." He pressed something into my hand, a small pouch made of leather. "Wear this. It is blessed turquoise and silver. You'll need it." I almost wanted to laugh it off. Shapeshifters? Dark magic? But then I remembered those strange markings on the canyon wall, and how the dust had come from nowhere. And something else, something I hadn't told anyone yet. That morning, walking back from Joe's farm, I'd seen my own footprints in the sand ahead of me, as if I'd already walked that path. But I hadn't. The next day, 2 hikers went missing. Their backpacks were found neatly placed at the base of a canyon wall, everything inside arranged in perfect circles. And beside the backpacks were tracks, human footprints that turned into coyote prints halfway along, then changed into bird talons before disappearing completely. That's when I realized Thomas was right. Something was hunting in our canyon, something that wore many faces, and somehow I knew I was the one who had to stop it. The search for the missing hikers began the next morning. I led a team of 3 other rangers, Mike, Sarah, and Dave. We'd all worked together for years, but something felt different that day. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe, even though the sky was clear. "Look at this," Sarah called out, pointing to something on the ground. We gathered around what looked like a small circle of stones, but these weren't just randomly placed. They were arranged in a pattern I'd never seen before. In the center lay a small pile of what looked like animal bones, bleached white by the sun. "I don't like this, John," Mike said, shifting nervously. "My grandmother used to tell stories about circles like these, said they were doorways to somewhere else." That's when we heard it, a voice calling for help. It sounded like a young woman, probably one of the missing hikers, but something wasn't right. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "This way!" Dave started moving toward the sound, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said, remembering Thomas's warnings. "Something's not right. Listen carefully." The voice called again, but this time I noticed what was wrong. It was the same exact call, like a recording being played over and over. No person calls for help the exact same way twice. Suddenly, the wind picked up. A dust storm appeared out of nowhere, just like before, but this one was different. Through the swirling sand, I saw shapes moving, dark figures that seemed to walk on all fours one moment and stand upright the next. "Stay together," I shouted, pulling out the pouch Thomas had given me. The blessed turquoise felt warm in my hand. That's when I saw it, a figure that looked exactly like Sarah standing at the edge of the storm, waving at us to follow. but Sarah was right next to me, gripping my arm in fear. "Don't look at it," I warned the others. "Whatever you do, don't look at their faces." The dust got thicker, and the shapes moved closer. I could hear whispers now, voices that sounded like people I knew, calling our names, trying to get us to follow them into the storm. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Then Dave screamed. Through the dust, I saw him pointing at something. There, not 20 feet away, stood what looked like Dave himself, smiling at us with too many teeth. "Run!" I yelled, pulling Sarah and Mike back the way we came. "Back to the trucks, now!" We ran like we'd never run before. Behind us, I could hear footsteps, too many footsteps, like a crowd of people running, even though we were the only ones there. Or at least, the only human ones. When we finally made it back to our vehicles, Dave wasn't with us. We called for him until our voices gave out, but he never answered. All we found were his footprints in the sand, leading toward the heart of the canyon before suddenly stopping, as if he'd vanished into thin air. That night, sitting in my cabin, I knew things were about to get much worse. The skinwalkers weren't just hunting anymore. They were playing with us, learning about us. And somehow, I had to find a way to stop them before they took anyone else. After losing Dave, things got worse fast. People started seeing double, not just rangers, but tourists too. A family from Ohio ran into the ranger station one morning, shaking and crying. They swore they'd seen their teenage son walking on the canyon rim while he was still asleep in their camping tent. I spent that night digging through old papers in Thomas's house. He brought out dusty books and scrolls, things passed down through generations. As he translated the ancient Navajo writings, my stomach turned cold. "Every 70 years," Thomas read slowly, "when the drought comes and the moon goes dark, they return. They hunt until the eclipse passes." "How do we stop them?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Thomas pointed to a drawing of the canyon. "There's a cave, deep in Shadow Canyon. That's where they rest during the day. That's where their power comes from." He looked at me with tired eyes. "But John, no one who's gone looking for it has ever come back." The next morning, I found strange tracks outside my cabin. Wolf prints that turned into bear tracks. Then human footprints, all in the same line. They led right up to my window. Something had been watching me sleep. Later that day, I got a call about Sarah. They found her ranger hat by the old petroglyphs, but no other signs of her. What scared me most was the radio call I got from her an hour later, asking for backup at a completely different location. But by then, I knew it wasn't really her calling. Mike refused to go out on patrol anymore. Can't blame him. He said he kept seeing himself standing at the end of every trail he walked, just watching and smiling. That evening, I sat with Thomas again. He taught me an old protection ritual and helped me make special bullets with melted down silver and crushed turquoise. My hand shook as I loaded them into my service revolver. "The eclipse is in 3 days," Thomas warned. "That's when they'll be strongest, but it's also when they'll be most vulnerable." He handed me an old leather map. "The cave entrance will appear when the moon starts to disappear. You'll have one chance, John, one chance to end this." That night, as I drove home, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Standing in the middle of the road was Dave, or something wearing Dave's face. It smiled at me with that too wide grin, and its eyes reflected my headlights like an animal's. I swerved around it, but in my mirror, I saw it change shape, dropping to all fours, becoming something that wasn't human or animal, but something in between. I knew then that I couldn't wait for the eclipse. I had to find that cave. But first, I needed to understand what these things really were, and why they'd chosen our canyon. The answers, I felt sure, were in those strange markings I'd found that first morning, if I could just figure out what they meant before it was too late. The next morning, I went back to those strange markings I'd found on the canyon wall. This time, I brought my old army camera to take pictures. But when I tried to photograph the symbols, every picture came out blurry, like someone had shaken the camera. While I was there, I heard something that made me freeze. the sound of children laughing. In this remote part of the canyon, there shouldn't be any kids around. I followed the sound, my hand on my gun with the special bullets. Behind a large rock, I found a group of small footprints in the sand. They started as child-sized prints but slowly changed into coyote tracks, then bird prints, then disappeared completely. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then my radio crackled to life. "John?" It was Mike's voice. "John, I found something. You need to see this. I'm by the old burial grounds." I knew Mike hadn't gone on patrol for days. This wasn't him. "Where are you really?" I spoke into the radio, my voice firm. The radio crackled again. This time, Mike's voice came out wrong, like 3 people talking at once. "Everywhere, John. We're everywhere now." That's when I noticed the temperature dropping. In the middle of an Arizona afternoon, I could see my breath. The air turned cold enough to make my teeth chatter. Around me, the shadows on the canyon walls began to move, even though the sun hadn't shifted. I started walking quickly back to my truck, trying not to run. Running attracts predators. That's one thing the Army taught me that still holds true. Behind me, I could hear footsteps matching my pace. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they sped up. I didn't look back. I remembered Thomas's warning, "Never look directly at them unless you have to. That's how they get in your head." Just as I reached my truck, I heard Mike's voice again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the radio. It was right behind me. "John," it said, "why won't you look at me?" I jumped into my truck and started the engine. In my rearview mirror, I saw not just Mike, but Sarah and Dave too, all standing together, all smiling those wrong smiles. As I drove away, they changed shape, melting into each other like shadows at sunset. Back at Thomas's house, he was waiting for me with more bad news. "The eclipse," he said, pointing to a calendar. "It's coming sooner than we thought, tomorrow night." I felt the blood drain from my face. We weren't ready. I hadn't found the cave yet. And now, those things were getting bolder, coming out in broad daylight. "There's something else," Thomas said quietly. "Something I should have told you earlier." He pulled out an old photograph, yellow with age. In it, I saw my grandfather as a young man, standing with a group of tribal elders. They were all holding silver bullets and turquoise stones. "Your grandfather," Thomas said, "was the last one to face them, 70 years ago." I stared at that old photograph for a long time. My grandfather had never told me about this. He died when I was 15, taking his secrets with him. But now I understood why he'd always warned me about walking in the canyon after dark. "Your grandfather wounded their leader," Thomas said, pointing to some notes in the old journal. "But he couldn't finish it. Now they're back, and they're angry." Just then, the lights in Thomas's house flickered and went out. Through the window, I saw dust rising in the distance. Another unnatural storm was coming. But this one was bigger than any before. "They know we're talking about them," Thomas whispered. He quickly lit some sage and grabbed his truck keys. "We need to get to the cave before dark. I'll show you where your grandfather found it." As we drove deeper into the canyon, the dust storm followed us. In the swirling sand, I kept seeing shapes, sometimes animals, sometimes people. Once, I swore I saw myself walking alongside our truck, keeping pace, even though we were doing 40 miles per hour. Thomas pointed to a narrow path leading up the canyon wall. "There. The cave entrance should be up there when the eclipse starts." Suddenly, our truck engine died. No matter how many times I turned the key, it wouldn't start. The dust storm was getting closer, and in it, I could hear voices. My grandfather's voice, Mike's voice, Sarah's voice, all calling out at once. "Run!" Thomas shouted, grabbing his bag of blessed items. We jumped out of the truck and started climbing the path. Behind us, the storm was getting closer, and the voices were getting louder. Halfway up the path, Thomas stopped. "John," he said in a strange voice, "look at this." He pointed to something on the ground. But I remembered his teachings. Never trust anyone completely during an eclipse time, not even your friends. Thomas, I said carefully, what was the blessing you taught me yesterday? He smiled that wrong smile, the one with too many teeth. Oh, John, he said, but it wasn't Thomas's voice anymore. It was something deeper, older, hungrier. Your grandfather asked the same question. I pulled out my gun with the silver bullets, but the thing wearing Thomas's face was faster. It changed shape, becoming something dark and twisted, with too many limbs. The real Thomas, I realized with horror, was probably back at his house. I fired one of my silver bullets, and the creature screamed, a sound like a mountain lion mixed with human crying. It stumbled back, giving me enough time to run. As I climbed higher, I could hear them coming after me, not just one, but many. The eclipse was starting, the sky growing darker by the minute. I had to find that cave. It was our only chance to end this. But first, I had to survive the climb, with a pack of skinwalkers right behind me, all wearing familiar faces, all hungry for the same thing, me. I ran up that narrow path as fast as I could, my lungs burning with each breath. The sky was getting darker. The eclipse was starting. Behind me, I could hear them climbing, their movements quick and unnatural, like spiders on a wall. My flashlight beam caught something ahead, an opening in the rock face that wasn't there before. The cave. But as I got closer, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, in the entrance, stood my grandfather, looking exactly like he did in that old photograph. Come inside, grandson, he said, holding out his hand. You'll be safe here. My heart ached seeing him there, but I knew better now. My grandfather, I said, raising my gun, never called me grandson. He always called me Little Wolf. The thing wearing my grandfather's face snarled, its features melting like wax. But before it could change completely, I fired a silver bullet. It screamed and fell back into the cave. I followed it inside, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. The cave was bigger than I expected, going deep into the mountain. On the walls were more of those strange symbols, but these were glowing faintly in the dark. Then I heard it, the real Thomas's voice, weak but alive. John? Over here. In a corner of the cave, I found them, Thomas, Sarah, Mike, and even Dave, all tied up with what looked like shadows. They were alive, but barely. The skinwalkers hadn't killed them. They'd kept them alive to steal their faces and memories. Behind you, Sarah screamed. I turned just in time to see them coming. 5 shapes moving in the dark, changing forms as they came. One looked like me, another like Thomas, and the others kept shifting between animal and human shapes. The leader stepped forward, the one I'd shot earlier. It still had part of my grandfather's face, twisted into something horrible. Your grandfather couldn't stop us, it said in a voice like rocks grinding together. What makes you think you can? But I had something my grandfather didn't. I had his experience, passed down through Thomas's teachings, and I had those silver bullets. Most importantly, I knew their secret now. These things, these skinwalkers, they weren't just monsters. They were the shadows of ancient medicine men who'd turned evil, and shadows can't exist in pure light. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my last weapon, a flare gun loaded with a special round Thomas had helped me make. It was filled with powdered silver and blessed turquoise. The eclipse was reaching its peak outside, and the skinwalkers were getting stronger. But that's when I remembered what Thomas had said. They're most powerful during the eclipse, but also most vulnerable. I had one shot to end this. One chance to finish what my grandfather started 70 years ago. The skinwalkers moved closer, their shapes twisting and changing in the dark. I could smell something awful, like wet fur and rotting leaves. My hands were shaking, but I kept the flare gun pointed at the leader. You can't kill us all, the leader growled, its face still half my grandfather's, half something else. We are as old as these canyons. Maybe, I said, remembering Thomas's words, but everything has a weakness. They lunged at me all at once. I waited until they were close. So close I could see their eyes glowing in the dark. Then I fired the flare gun straight up at the cave ceiling. The special round exploded, filling the whole cave with burning silver light. The skinwalkers screamed, not like animals or humans, but like the wind howling through empty canyons. The blessed silver and turquoise powder rained down on them like tiny stars. Where the powder touched them, their shadows started burning away. The leader tried to change shape one last time, but it couldn't hold any form. It reached for me with hands that kept turning into claws, then wings, then nothing at all. "This isn't over," it hissed in my grandfather's voice. "We'll come back in 70 years. "Not this time," I said, and threw Thomas's pouch of blessed turquoise at it. The pouch burst open, and the leader dissolved like smoke in the wind. The others followed, their shapes melting away until nothing was left but ordinary shadows on the cave walls. I quickly untied Thomas and the others. They were weak but alive. As we helped each other out of the cave, the eclipse was ending. The sun was coming back, filling the canyon with normal, clean light. Thomas looked at me with tired but proud eyes. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. "You finished what he started." We made our way down the canyon path slowly. The dust storms were gone. Birds were singing again. Everything felt normal. But I knew things would never be quite the same. I'd seen what lives in the shadows of our canyon, and I'd always be watching for it. That night, I sat on my cabin porch with Thomas. He was marking the date in his journal, writing down everything that happened. "Will they really come back?" I asked. "In 70 years? Thomas shook his head. "You did what your grandfather couldn't. You destroyed their shadow forms completely." "But," he looked out at the canyon, "there are other things out there, John. Other old stories that turn out to be true." I touched the turquoise pendant now hanging around my neck, a gift from Thomas. The canyon stretched out before us, peaceful in the moonlight. But now I knew what could hide in those shadows, and I would be ready. After all, that's what rangers do. We protect people, even from the things they don't believe in. Some nights when I'm on patrol and the moon is full, I think I hear voices on the wind or see strange tracks in the sand. But they're just ordinary sounds, ordinary tracks. The skinwalkers are gone. At least, that's what I keep telling myself.